I am Navneet Kumar, and it is my great honor to welcome all of you, all the distinguished set of academicians across a range of disciplines who are here for the opening session of this PAWS Web initiative. So I'll just give a brief intro of the whole initiative before I hand over the session's proceeding to Dr. Nishant Kumar. So this initiative, it aims to examine the human and the non-human entanglement in a contested space. And it is being, we aim to examine it from a multidisciplinary perspective. And we want to address the questions of sustainability, which have become so important in the 21st century. We want to examine things at a very fundamental level than what we perceive currently. So in this regard, I would want to cite a study which was recently published by some researchers at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. It was led by Tobias Anderman, who posited that an estimated 558 mammal species will go extinct in the next 80 years as the century comes to an end. The same report, the study also reported that a minimum of 351 species have gone extinct in the past 26,000 years, out of which, out of these 351, 80 of them have been known in our historical records from fossil examinations and all. So the decline which they are presenting, or which they have estimated, it is like 1700 times faster. It's a huge magnitude. And it is from this study that they say that there is still hope for conservation efforts. We can reduce the threat of the magnitude of this threat if we have our conservation efforts aligned in the direction of a very thorough scientific approach, a good level of understanding of the natural systems. So now this depth of knowledge and understanding of systems is where this PAWS Web initiative is featuring in. It's a step in that direction. It has its origin in the research initiatives that have been undergoing in this part of the world, the megacity of Delhi, for the past few years. And it got strengthened during the interactions with Dr. Man Barua, who, while he was working in Delhi in the last 2 to 3 years. So while this collaboration of this network of experts in the PAWS Web initiative that we have gathered till now, as this collaboration strengthens, we envision that this initiative will transform into a recognized think tank which can put forth knowledge pieces aligned to tackle the challenges of sustainability in the 21st century, backed by thorough interdisciplinary research inputs. So on this note, I would not delay it further and hand over the proceedings of this session to Dr. Nishant Kumar, who take the discussion further. Over to you, Nishant Bhaiya.
Thank you, Navneet. A warm welcome to everyone. Very happy to see this gathering moving in action today. And many thanks for supporting it from months to years as I was trying to deal with this topic of research and its applications for tropical megacities for several years now. And I think these discussions have ranged from my parents' institutions, Wildlife Institute of India and University of Oxford's Zoology Department, and out from there to multiple collaborators who have agreed to add their respective expertise in this direction. So the discussion about human and animal relationships are nothing new. Of course, if we recall the cave paintings, we have seen depictions of how humans have always been interested in the non-human entities around, and it was never only in the form of consumptive units, but also in context of rituals and cultures. There are multiple disciplines, and here on the screen, there are multiple disciplines which try and study this human and non-human systems from their own perspectives. But currently, we are facing a global lockdown, and it is clearly emanated from how these systems are interacting together. Down through the session which we have today, and of course, 3 more sessions for scheduled for this year till 9th of November, we will elucidate more and we will have thorough discussions in this context. But somehow it is very necessary for us to understand that while we have been rapidly urbanizing our system over the last century, we somehow have failed to understand the basic nuances of scientific disciplines in context of what is a niche of an organism. So we recently lost a very prominent ecologist from Department of Zoology, Oxford, Professor Robert May. And due to his intervention, the science of ecology made a leapfrog jump while conceptualizing individual entities within the population. So the whole idea is that individuals constitute populations not only in terms of numbers, but they bring in their cultures, they bring in their genetic endowments, and they themselves become environments to other organisms of similar species and multiple species. I'm sorry if it sounds confusing now, but until we go on to a panel discussion, we have enough scheduled sessions to deal with those. So I'm sorry, this part of the screen is not visible. Yeah, so the lower part of the screen is visible, and on each screen, you have the set of experts who are supposedly going to answer a particular question. So the whole concept of PAWS web is based upon the balance sheet of the 20th century in context of what did we lose. If we focus on South Asia, the loss of vulture is very prominent. I definitely recall Ben asking me in the first day of my introduction in Edward Gray Institute about the impact of loss of vultures and its potential collateral effects on the gills of animals which are responding opportunistically to anthropogenic resources. So somehow all my discussions around the basic research I've been doing for 8-9 years has focused on the idea of opportunistic animal responses in this part of the world. But of course, slowly I could absorb that one could not take a singular lens of biological sciences. And then I could understand the dynamics at an integrated phase of humans and animals. And it is very tough to tease them apart and make sense in context of how the city actually functions as a large system. And of course, when we have nations and global systems which are in upgraded aspects of these systems, these questions make even more sense. So this picture here depicts the yesteryear situation of how the garbage dumps were perpetually occupied by very large vultures. So vultures are about 4 to 5 kilos in weight, and they have a much larger wingspan than the kites which are visible in this picture. This is not from a lockdown, and this picture is from 2013 when my master supervisor were trying to elucidate how to quantify the biomass available for these birds on this landfill unit. So these discussions bring me to the core question which our group is supposed to address. So for 5 decades or so, I have seen enormous literature which professes that we have a pro-animal attitude for animals in this part of the world, irrespective of the religious and cultural backgrounds. And of course, we have a certain way of waste disposal, which is not considered sustainable in many perspectives, because there are clear reports of scientific studies which have elucidated the impacts of poor waste disposal with situations of epidemics, etc. So the root question which I wish to address is that can we provide a mechanistic explanation to this pro-animal attitude? Because we have a very overarching idea about how animals are responding to humans in this part of the world, but we need to break it down into understandable fragments. So many scientific fraternities and non-scientific fraternities have achieved this in context of economic practices or economic interventions, or also in context of medical practices when people wish to tackle a disease at a large spatial scale. So once we try and understand the concept of pro-animal attitude, it is very necessary that we understand the concept of individual to population level variation, and not just of animals, but humans and animals as a unit, and not just in cities, but from cities to wilderness where animals do have to respond to human presence. So our discussion today would try and factor whether the pro-animal attitude is a cause or is it a consequence of our thousands of years of coexistence. Of course, we have certain experts with us who work with animal networks. And of course, the animal network science was borrowed from a well-established idea of network studies from social sciences. So associative networks are very clear signatures of how humans are responding to each other. And disassociative networks are typical of biological systems. But when we have on focus a system which has integrated human-animal interface throughout the landscape of South Asia and similar very fast developing systems, we need to develop a new approach, and PAWS Web is a vital intervention in that regard. Of course, this is built upon my doctoral thesis, which I completed last year in January. And a basic crux of my thesis says that nest site selection criteria of black kites, which are very opportunistic scavengers in this part of the world, is well established from individual to population scale on these three prime factors: habitable trees where they can make nests, easy food from human origin, more or less, and the human attitude to these birds, not only in context of their basic ecology, the defense, nest defense in context of anti-human or anti-predatory behavior. The same set of explanations explain the gradients of how well these kites were defending these units. And the units where we faced most of the attacks were the ones which were producing most of the offspring. So in biological terms, this has a clear payoff, and it allowed us to explain why this behavior of anti-human attack response is visible in this part of the world, and it is not visible in the kite populations which are being studied by my collaborator. So in context of the network, animal networks and social network theory, I could lay my hands upon this publication from colleagues, which came out. I think the name is not visible. I can share the paper later on the network. So few days ago, I was discussing it with my friends who are from social sciences, and they discussed the ideas of resilience loop. Tropical cities have to respond by resilience, and of course there is a vulnerability loop. So it would not make a lot of sense now, but I'm just giving a gist in context of how these loops are perpetually regulated from this part on evolutionary scale and on this part on ecological scale. And our task would be to elucidate it not only for humans, but for humans and animals in an integrated system, as we are changing our cities at a very rapid rate. A vital aspect in context of our analysis would factor an understanding of urban spaces for humanimals. I'm saying humanimals because this is how the research would likely progress, and it would set the study by contextualizing fossorial, ground-dwelling, arboreal, and aerial animals. And the scientific aspect of this study would try and study the progressive links from mating systems to survivorship of these animals, and of course the population densities which they exhibit in response to anthropogenic resources. Further upon, we know from basic sciences and published literature that there is a clear feedback loop at each stage, which should be our hallmark in context of how we establish it. If you do not follow whatever I'm clicking further, would be explained in our further sessions, but we are interested in understanding the behavioral strategies and how they are linked with evolutionary and cultural gains at the human-animal interface. We have experts who deal with communication within animals, and of course, there are biological explanations around it, and we have social science experts to deal with these questions. And I will try and extend the approach I have had for my studies on kites onto something which would allow us to understand the animal social networks in relation to the urban structure as such. And of course, the applied aspect of all our efforts are directed to understand whether such urban responses of human and animals in an integrated system are going to affect the overall health. So there is a new discipline in context of how human, animal, and environmental health are correlated with each other, and we try and answer these mega questions under the roof of One Health, which is the modern approach and which is supposedly demanded for the current focus. Of course, there are a lot of bones of contention when people from multiple disciplines come on one table, and I would try and read out without taking much time an excerpt from the interview which happened in between Parvez Hudboy and Noam Chomsky. I think the second name does not need a lot of introduction, but Professor Parvez Hudboy is the top nuclear scientist from Pakistan, and he asserted in that discussion that in science, a much higher degree of objectivity is possible. And of course, this objectivity was in context of how well few scientific methods are potentially able to predict things at a given scale. In response of that assertion, Chomsky responded that it is in context of the scales at which we wish to operate and answer questions. So I think we have spent certain amount of time observing whatever we can bring on table as multidisciplinary experts and questions which transgress from one discipline to another. And in that context, PAWS Web would attempt to provide scientific explanations or quantitative explanations in context of what our social scientists colleagues have done for decades. So the scale of observation from sciences has been enhanced by incorporation of units from local scales to landscape scales, and the landfills pictures which you were just seeing depicted the movement of kites which we tagged in 2014 to 2019 from the landfills in Delhi to the Central Asia and back. It will recently be published in the journal Scientific Reports, and it signifies that how local changes would have global impact in context of socio-ecological relationships of a multitude of species. If we just contextualize birds which are moving from Central Asia to the Indian subcontinent in the numbers which stretch into millions, this is something which should set the alarm ringing for somebody who has a basic understanding of human-animal relationship in context of potential threats of pathogens which can be distributed along this pathway, and of course the toxicants which can be exchanged in a similar fashion. And this slide depicts an overview of why the established research by Zhu and colleagues published in the journal Scientific Reports in context of the movement of water birds from Central Asia or from the northern parts of Asia towards the southern parts is differentiating the genetic clades of bird flu virus. You see fewer triangles in South Asia, which essentially depict why we need to do more research, and the black arrows here depict the arrows which birds like black kites and different waterfowls use to move into the Indian subcontinent. Sorry if this needs more elucidation, and I think the past discussion has established why we need this kind of integration to address the question about human-animal interface in context of communication, in context of development of social networks, which are inextricable if we just imagine human component or the animal component, And last but not the least, the cooperation and conflict which goes at this interface. As the last conjuncture in context of what would be the application of our efforts, I am positing, and this is something which our senior colleagues can evaluate, I see that randomized control trial design is readily utilized by people who wish to intervene economically in context of securing health of a large number of people. And of course, our friends from health department have utilized a similar fashion. So if as a collective unit, we are able to understand our subjects, the human animal interface in a certain fashion in context of translocations of animals from one part of the city to another part in case it is a gentrifying drive or if it is in a drive in context of reducing the conflicts which are happening in a certain part. So I guess once we develop a certain understanding down the line after 4-5 years, this randomized RCT design can be our approach. So I would thank you for your attention, and I would request Navneet to lead us into the second part of the session. Thank you.
Thank you.
For taking a few extra minutes.
Thank you, Veya. Thank you so much. So we'll just begin with a short round of introduction, which will just take 30 seconds for each of the participants who are present here. So we'll begin with the core enlisted members on the PAWS Web initiative, which are currently enrolled with us.
Hello, I am Aldina Franco. I am associate professor at the University of East Anglia, and I work with animal movement and development of new tracking technologies, I guess, in general.
Hello everyone, I am Aparajita, doing my Master's in Development Studies from Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Hyderabad. I have been associated with Nishant's team since 2013. In 2016-17, we did a research at Ghazipur landfill and one of the squatter colony around that landfill. And based on that study, we were able to establish a relationship between role of urban waste and how it produces human-animal ecologies around it. Now, as a part of my master's dissertation, I am exploring various ideas around Ghazipur landfill and the women who live in the squatter colony around that.
Hi, my name is Avdhendra Sharan. I'm a professor at the Center for Study of Development Societies, Delhi. I'm a historian by training and wrote a book on Delhi a couple of years back that dealt in part with animals in the city. So I guess that's my interest in this project.
Hello everybody, it's very nice to see faces, those that are there, to put with names. I'm a retired professor of development studies at Oxford University and an emeritus fellow at Wolfson College. In my retirement, I've been looking at the Indian economy, which I've been studying since 1969 as a waste producing system. So I've worked on greenhouse gases in agriculture, but I become asymptotic with Nishant Kumar's work through the study of waste in a small town. In particular, through the fieldwork that I've done, I've been looking at food waste and what happens to it, and the relationships between that food waste and the animal economy of a small town.
Hello, my name is Ben Sheldon. I'm a professor of ornithology in the Department of Zoology at the University of Oxford. So most of my research is based around trying to understand the ways in which animals and primarily birds respond to changing environments, and that's both in terms of ecological responses to climate change, but also how social behaviour enables them to respond to changing conditions. So I've done quite a bit of work on sort of social networks and the evolution of social structure and how that underpins the responses of populations. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Dara. I'm a research fellow in the zoology department at Oxford University and the natural resources department at Cornell University. I study evolution and human behaviour, and I'm interested in how people maximize the fitness benefits and minimize the fitness costs of living alongside other species. And I'm especially interested in how adaptive behaviors manifest as what we would call conservation ethics at the level of our individual moral psychology and at population level rules and norms.
Hi, I'm Gaurav. I am an engineer by training and I did my master's in public policy from Oxford. I worked with the Indian government for a while and I'm interested in areas around tech policy as well as urban development policy. So my interest with PAWS comes from the urban development side of things.
Hi, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm Gregor Larson. I'm a geneticist, and I am the professor of evolutionary genomics within the Department of Archaeology here at Oxford. And I run an ancient DNA facility, and a lot of our questions focus around human-animal interactions in sort of more recent as well as deep time, trying to unpick the ways in which people and animals have been getting together over long periods of time and what effect that's had on the animals and the people themselves in terms of dispersal and evolution and adaptation and a whole range of other things, mostly around domestication, but not exclusively.
Hi, I'm Kritika. I work as senior lecturer in human geography at the University of Edinburgh. My work lies at the intersection of the fields of political ecology and animal studies, and I basically look at human-animal interactions and human-nature interactions in a range of domains in order to, with a focus on understanding how these interactions are shaped by the broader social and political context.
Oh, hi, thank you, Nishant, for bringing us all together. I've known Nishant for quite a while now when I was in Oxford. I'm a lecturer at the University of Cambridge in the Department of Geography, and we run a ERC research project that looks at how cities are governed by regulating non-human life. The three cities we focus on are London, Delhi, and Guwahati. And the project essentially looks at sort of 3 or 4 key themes. The first has to do with urban infrastructure and how animal life adapts to infrastructural environments. The second has to do with thinking about animal ethology. And this is where I collaborate with Anindya Sinha, who's based in NIAS in Bangalore. We look at how stray dogs, and some of our PhD students are here as well, stray dogs, macaques, cattle, and pigs actually kind of learn to inhabit the urban environment. The third theme, which is where my work is heading, is actually look at urban metabolism and questions about chemicals and waste and how they kind of interface with animal bodies in urban environments. And fourthly, we're interested in this question of biopolitics. So how is the urban governed and regulated through intervening in non-human populations, be it through veterinary practices, be it through state initiatives, and so on and so forth.
Good evening. I'm Kamar Qureshi. I'm a scientist at Wildlife Institute of India. My interests are largely large-scale monitoring of wildlife population, both aquatic and terrestrial ecosystem. And I'm also interested in reproductive control of problem animals. That's what these are the 2 fields I'm pursuing currently, as well as I have a long-term interest in landscape ecology.
Shalini's mic is not working, so she requested me to give a background of what she does. So a few days ago, she was quite funny in saying that when I was convening the poster, I should rather mention that she is a multidisciplinary sociologist, of course, which can extend into films and in bringing all possible trans perspectives or queer perspectives within established sets of genres. So Shalini is an associate professor at Indian Institute of Science, Education and Research in the city of Pune, and she would be linked with us to answer questions on resilience of tropical cities in context of climate change. So her support would be vital for PAWS in that regard. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sushruth. I work as a professor of cultural psychiatry at University College London. I trained as a psychiatrist both in India and in the UK, and subsequently did my PhD in medical anthropology at UCL, examining the cultural experience of depression amongst white natives of London. My research interests are broadly in the domain that relates mental health and marginality in the broadest possible way. So in London, I work as a street psychiatrist with the homeless population. And in India, I've been working and trialing out models of political therapeutic interventions with individual Dalit subjects who have been distressed by their caste identity. I'm also the founding editor of the journal Anthropology and Medicine, and I have been working with Man Barua on human-elephant conflict at the human end of the spectrum, and also with his current project that is in Delhi on human-macaque relationship. I have not directly worked with Nishant, although I know him and we've had many conversations, and I have stood to be educated a lot from both Nishant and Man on the basics of human geography.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. I am a cognitive scientist. I'm based at Central European University. I work in particular on evolution, the links between evolution, cognition, and communication. Well, particularly evolution and communication, and human communication in particular.
Hi, I'm an associate professor at the University of Technology, Sydney, and I'm also the director of the Centre for Compassion and Conservation. Most of my work focuses on coexistence, primarily in production landscapes, where the primary focus is on conflict and persecution of wildlife. But also we work in a range of species, primarily canids, but also megaherbivores. In the last little while, I've been collaborating with Kritika Srinivasan on some projects that she's got going, and we've recently planning some work in some cities that she's probably going to talk about a bit later.
Thanks everyone, nice to meet you all. And I would start by saying thanks to Nishant and Ujjwal for organizing and coordinating this meeting. I'm a departmental lecturer at University of Oxford, and my work is on mathematical modeling and statistical forecasting. So this is all a new exciting area for me, and looking forward to further developments.
Hello everybody, it's great to see so many familiar faces as well as new ones. I've been involved in studying black kites for almost 7 years now. I'm currently working with the Wildlife Institute of India for the same project. And over the many years, I've developed a lot of interest in studying human-animal interactions. And the study species that are focused have spanned from black kites to macaques and cattle in Delhi.
Hi everyone, my name is Prashant Kumar, and I'm a practicing advocate at the High Court of Judicature at Patna. I derived my motivation through the rights-based litigation concerning acid attack survivors, animal rights, as well as public interest litigations concerning environment and ecology.
Thank you, Prashant. Thank you, Prashant. I'll end this round, this segment by introducing myself. I'm Navneet Kumar, and I am a marketing entrepreneur who's associating with this initiative to help with or contribute on the aspects of project management, program management. And I'm interested in learning more about the individual level behavior of human participants of the system under question, the applied aspects of management interventions, and some policy level initiatives, which we will probably draw inputs from under this initiative. So with that, I would request Dr. Nishant Kumar to move on to the next segment of panel discussions. If you could please begin, sir.
Thanks a lot, Navneet. That was wonderful. And sorry if people were slightly bored through this round of discussion. I also have to apologize to external members who are part of this inaugural session that we had limited scope of introductions possible. So if you continue to associate with us in future meetings, we would definitely get to know you through in context of your thorough detail and your research motivation. So I guess the best person to start pitching about how the whole history to the modern time association of human and animals in a varied landscape or in context of varying geographies across different worlds is Professor Greg Larson. So Greg, in context of your research on domestication, I guess you have read this question. So I'm asking, how do you think or how do you perceive that this research will benefit by linking archaeological perspectives or evolutionary genomic perspectives from how you examine your specimens and the context of behavioral norms? So behavioral ecologists in context of certain behaviors which are well suited into a certain section of the landscape of the patch which they occupy are regulating the population level movements. So I will not go into nuances. I would request you to answer this. Thank you.
Sure. I mean, that's your last point there is ultimately the question, right? I mean, I think that what we are really interested in, a lot of what we do is looking at the pattern. When we talk about the pattern, we're looking at the genomic pattern across a landscape through space and time. And so, 15 years ago, we were doing this a lot with mitochondrial DNA. We've shifted, of course, using both mitochondria and now nuclear signatures, and looking at patterns of ancestry and admixture and hybridization. And that's giving us an insight into sort of what's happened. What we still lack, though, is a real appreciation of the process. And I think that what's really fun to do, and when you're thinking about domestication, is these questions about how and why, possibly even necessarily, although why I don't like so much because it implies a very top-down, human-centric, deliberate action, which isn't always the case. And I think a lot of that probably comes out of a lot of your research as well, where what you're really looking at when you're thinking about domestication is it's an emergent characteristic between the interaction between people and animals. Yep. And those emergent characteristics can take on a huge range of different, it's across the spectrum. And I think that we often get bogged down in a lot of our terminology. When we're thinking about wild and domestic, those are often very dichotomous. And so we tend to think of something that's very distant from people, and then something that is either distant from people because it's in a giant factory in Brazil and it's being harvested alongside billions of other chickens, or because it's super close to us because it's a dog that happens to be on our sofa. And everything that is in between all of that really, I think, gives a great deal more insight into that process. And so I think your slides do a brilliant service to that, where what you're talking about is animals becoming more accustomed to a human niche with greater or lesser amounts of the degree of human both intentionality as well as intervention into those life ways, and however intentional that may or may not be, and how that then starts to affect the animals themselves. And I think from all of this, we can start to really wed together the archaeological, the deep time perspective with more modern approaches to looking at the range of that different possibility. And South Asia is a great place for this, because a lot of those kinds of relationships have ceased to exist in Western Europe. We don't have a whole lot of, say, street dogs, for example. In Portugal, perhaps, and a bit in Spain, but as soon as you start moving further north along latitudinal lines, they're just not there anymore because of different ways in which those societies and those cities have dealt with those different animals within them. So I think what for me is most exciting about this is really, as it seems like, as a really neat mechanism to kind of get us out of or away from, or at least make maximal use of, pattern by really starting to think about process. And how can we best think about process by integrating the insights from a wide range of different approaches that include not just museums and archaeological material, but also modern studies looking at ethnographies and ecologies and ethnographies of humans and animals and all the different ways in which they're interacting across cities and other spaces across the world.
Thank you. So before we reach out to our friends from social sciences in context of how they have already built the turf of pluralistic approaches, which a lot of scientific approaches are incorporating in this decade itself, I would like to request Professor Ben Sheldon and Professor Kamal Qureshi, so they can speak one after the other, starting with Ben. So Ben, you have now a certain idea. So I started discussing these things in context of utilizing animal social networks and its imagination of this aspect within a very rapidly evolving city. So by the perspective of how cities in this part of the world, which are heterogeneously developed, are demarcating certain animal personalities into a specific section, which is in context of a very innate response of these animal populations. How do you think it is feasible to bring down your research experience to address the questions of associative and dissociative networks? And of course, these networks would be formed by associative or dissociative responses in context of mating systems. So from a large network structure, which is a population level phenomenon, to mating systems, which are largely a group or individual level response. Thank you.
Okay, so there's quite a lot of things there. So maybe I'm going to just take a step back and just try to simplify. And perhaps the easiest thing is just to put this in the context of an issue that we're all wrestling with globally at the moment, which is fundamentally, we're trying to understand how to control COVID-19 in our populations. And there are two crucial factors there that relate to the way that interactions between people are structured. One is, in some sense, the amount of interactions that we have. As I speak, the UK Prime Minister is just talking about some new restrictions that are coming into place in Britain, which are based around reducing the number of contacts between people. And of course, we all know that that is a crucial parameter in terms of understanding the transmission of properties between individuals, be they individuals of the same species or individuals of different species. The other key aspect as well, and this is also coming very much into the debate around COVID-19, is to do with the degree of assortment of those networks. And that's really a measure of the extent to which like individuals associate with like. Of course, in the case of COVID-19, it's because we know that the risk of mortality in relation to age is extremely correlated with age. And of course, there's lots of discussion around, shielding elderly, more vulnerable people, whereas younger people may be at lower risk of serious impacts. So actually, these two things are sort of separate considerations about understanding the importance of a social network for the transmission of any property. So I guess for me, that's the fundamental interest here is, so we can develop what social networks allow us to do effectively is to add structure to interactions between elements. So we can count how many people there are, how many kites there are, how many rats there are, how many dogs there are, whatever we like. But a simple null model that says, all of these individuals interact with each other with an equal probability is, as we know, very unlikely to be an accurate description of the truth. The extent to which we depart from that very simple null model tells us how useful a social network approach will be to actually understanding the way that these different species interact with each other. So I think that's probably what I would say in relation to that. How that relates to sort of longer term properties of species, you talked about sort of evolved differences. I don't know. I mean, I think there's a lot of evidence that social structures respond rapidly to sort of ecological variables over time. So if we manipulate, the things that determine where animals go, where they find themselves, then typically we see a very quick response in terms of the social network. And again, actually going back to COVID-19, of course, this is why the UK government is restricting access to restaurants and bars at the moment. So, because we know that's a thing that will determine people's activity patterns. So, I think these are sort of crucial things to understand: is how the sort of landscape of opportunities influences that social structure, and then ultimately what non-randomness there is in interactions between individuals. Okay.
Thanks a lot, Ben. I guess it is wonderful that we are in a specific time frame where people whose careers have been built on studying zoological specimens, live or preserved, are suddenly talking about the relationships which put humans and animals together. So I think it is unprecedented in context of history of how well we are focusing things on a systemic scale. And that sets the tone for why OSWEB is a good opportunity to integrate our heads. Of course, this will not be an easy thing. So I will restrict Professor Qureshi from responding to the specific question, which was in context of reproductive control, which Wildlife Institute of India is trying to institute in context of the demands from cities like Delhi, where, or for all India as such, where every 2 seconds we have a dog bite. So I would request Professor Avdhendra Sharan to give a short perspective from what he just learned now through the discussions. And of course, he has been with a whole team of researchers from different disciplines. So we will fall short of time in that context. For next responders, I would respect all of us to restrict our responses to 3 minutes. So Professor Sharan, please. Thank you.
Okay, let me be very brief. Quite obviously, all of us are trying to struggle with how to think through COVID. And there is a way in which cities have not thought about animals. At a time when this interaction seems so threatening, suddenly there's waking up to it. And so I think it's a good time to think about it. And where does urban planning go, for instance, when it comes to animals? Also, I think one of the things that we might want to think about a bit more is that not all animals have historically been of concern. So what makes particular species of concern has to do a lot with all kinds of things that go around, whether it has to do with culture that you were mentioning, or whether it has to do with health. So that part of it, why does a particular species attract our attention at a particular moment and other species don't? Those are really questions of interest to us. I'd also be interested in paying a bit more attention to what happens to people who deal with particular animals. So people who live with pigs, or with cows, or with goats, or with horses. Each set of people is looked at very differently. And so there's a whole history of conflict around animals and around humans who live with those animals and work with those animals. And that conflict needs to be understood, because some of these conflicts are very deep and they don't go away easily. And in that context, the reason I bring it up is even an innocent word like, say, social distancing has a very different resonance in a context where there's already a lot of social distancing. So what should ideally have been physical distancing, when used as social distancing, connotes something else altogether if you have been a marginal community over time, historically. So I think I would think about those questions to see what kind of historical research then makes sense today in light of what is happening around us. So that would be my response.
Thank you, Professor Sharan. And I think I have something to share in this context, which is quite relevant from the historical aspect of how people have responded to stray dogs, and particularly in context of how people from Islam have responded. So a few months ago, I was reading an excerpt or a blog article by Professor Mikhail from Yale University, who said that a few centuries ago, dogs were not as despised as they're despised by people who practice Islam, because in order to offer prayers, you need to perform certain cleanliness. And in that perspective, dogs are no more respected. But of course, when they did a certain ecosystem service, they were not as despised a few hundred years ago. And in context of COVID times, the state of Nagaland has instituted a ban on consumption of dog meat, and the whole world has a certain kind of fear in context of not the conventional meat consumption. And the whole idea of how cultures have responded very organically to what they consume from their environment around would be a deep question. And of course, this can factor in our manuscripts, which we can write from multiple disciplinary perspectives and also the grant application. So I would collectively like to address colleagues who have more than human approaches from social sciences in context of how political ecology idea is convened. So when we study science of ecology, we are very much interested in giving an experimental understanding of variable distribution and abundance of the animal specimen which is under focus. So if my friends from social sciences can answer that question of how do we convene the idea of political ecology? Do we also have the same ranging of individual to population level scaling, or does it differ? So Ban, Sushrut, Barbara, Kritika, Shalini, you can respond. Thank you. So, Banda,
sorry, Nishant, is that the order of people?
No, there's not. I think it's good that if we start, it will start something in one way or the other.
Okay, I'll keep it short. I think the interesting question around, the configuration of health and animals in cities is also methodological. So, you really have to ask, where is the ecology in political ecology? And 4 of our PhD students who are working in Delhi are here at the moment: Shruti, Shubhangi, Sneha, and Anmol. I just want to flag up Shubhangi's work, who's actually doing very innovative work looking at both the ethology of stray dogs, how they form pack behaviors, but also an ethnography of the way people relate to them in slum environments. And I think one key thing here is that, you had this sort of biopolitics of wanting to remove dogs because of rabies and so on and so forth, aesthetics and so on and so forth. But I think what her work really finds is also how, there are these affective bonds between people in these settlements and stray dogs, and dogs actually, work to generate infrastructures of security. So, when you look at this from bottom up, I think the whole question of disease and, dog ownership, those sort of relations get looked differently. But I think the take-home point here, which is the wider conversation to be had, is how do you bring ethnography and ecology into conversation and ethology into conversation to look at health?
Thank you. So Sushudra, Kritika, Barbara, if you would like to substantiate, Shalini as well.
I can go next if you want.
Yeah, sure. Thanks.
So to build on what Man was saying, I can speak a little bit about my own work on dogs and how that has over time incorporated a greater range of perspectives. So I started off way back in 2007 looking at these sort of legal and institutional spaces that govern human-dog relationships. And for the first several years of my work on street dogs in India, I was focusing on such spaces by looking at practices of killing, practice of neutering, practice of breeding, following which I moved to looking at everyday human-dog relations and how they in turn come into contact with these institutional and legal spaces and how they kind of evolve together and co-constitute each other. And in the process of doing that, what I think we also realized is that we need a greater range of disciplines coming together in order to really understand the complexity of the relationships that are at play. And at about 2015, we started some pilot work on street dogs in India in order to understand everyday interactions between people, dogs, and the landscape by bringing together a number of disciplines. So there's behavioral ecology, and I think Man's current collaborator Anindya was involved at that point in time. There was social psychology, and later on we had a historian join the team, and which then kind of produced our kind of some work on rabies and public health and street dogs. And it's that work now we are going to be taking forward in multiple sites, and again having multiple disciplines: social psychology, history, human geography, which is what I do, and behavioral ecology, which is what Dan Ramp, who introduced himself earlier, going to be doing, is going to do, to look at people-street dog relationships with a focus on understanding health implications at multiple sites within India. So I guess I would kind of expand your emphasis on looking at the relationship between politics and the social and ecology, to kind of say that, at least in the way I have approached this, what I found is that a greater number of disciplines and perspectives and approaches are needed: quantitative and qualitative, history, psychology, behavioral ecology, of course, and the kind of human geographical work and political ecological work that I do. So that has been a sort of like slow learning experience over time, which I think has been helpful in expanding the understanding of, and to just continue the example of human street dog relationships in India at multiple spaces, whether they be legal, institutional, everyday, or health, just to name a few.
Thanks. So Barbara, if you can give clear perspectives about systemic interactions, because Kritika and Man, they have talked about multiple units of systems, either constituted at the humanistic scale or when they constitute humans and animals together. So you have done a lot of research in a small town of India with respect to the food systems. And of course, none of the food systems are short of waste. So that has been the characteristic ever since we started settling down as sociable units. So will you please share your perspective about how those units or how the town has evolved in response to urbanization? Thanks.
Well, Nishant, thank you very much, but that's a big question, which I don't think I can properly answer. And you also asked about political ecology, and I can't properly answer that either, because my work is as a field economist. I suppose I'm best pigeonholed as a sort of funny economic anthropologist, but I've been looking at economies as waste-producing systems and tried to figure out a social unit through which it all makes sense. So firstly, a small town, and secondly, the circuits, the production of waste in the circuits of capital inside the town. That means the production of waste in production, so rice mills, alcohol factories, clothing, textiles, and so on and so forth. The production of waste in distribution, the production of waste in consumption, and the production of waste in social reproduction, which isn't sex, but the generational reproduction of the classes of Indian urban society. Now, in doing this work, I've encountered big surprises through looking at the vegetable wholesale market, which is the distribution circuit of capital, and looking at meals hotels, which everyone here will have enjoyed eating, and looking at food waste from meals hotels, which is quite a big industry in this town. So one is part of the circuit of distribution, and the other is part of, is a commodified, commercialized consumption waste. And I've had to think for myself, what is waste? What is vegetable waste? What is food waste? And it is classified by the people who work in those markets as cuttings and perished food, bruised food. It's all socially unacceptably bruised, speared food as it gets unloaded and unloaded, vegetable packaging, and then food with fungi and molds. Some is acceptable, but a lot isn't acceptable. So before one examines the economics of it all, what is waste? And that's a very interesting question. Then this waste is either fly tipped, then I look at where it goes and the surprises of these circuits of waste inside the town. Waste is fly tipped, and it's then raw material for dogs and for monkeys and for pigs that forage on the edge of town. It's piled up in huge piles at night for roaming animals. That means dogs and goats and cattle. But what interested me most is that it's collected as a free feed for a massive industry in the back streets. I would call it petty production, small scale industry, often done by women, the feeding of hens, goats, pigs. There are 700 pigs inside the town and another 1,000 on the hills outside the town, and hundreds of cattle, many of which are produced in very small enterprises, say 4 cows and 3 calves, in which there's a division of labor. So the men will graze the cattle, will clean the waste, which used to be done by women in villages, and will market the milk. And the women rear the cattle and milk the cattle and manage the credit of these enterprises. And what's very interesting and picks up with other studies of backstreet economy is that what they get from this kind of enterprise is about 2,000 rupees a month, which is chicken feed. I mean, not to this company, but very small incomes. And so yet again, we have complicated household economic structures where this enterprise, relying on free food waste and vegetable waste, doesn't actually support an entire household and has to be fused into micro portfolios of economic activity. Along with vegetable waste, there is also commodified husk from lentils, dal, gram, rice mills, which is sold. So it's semi-commodified and semi-free, the raw materials. And the reason why I'm talking about this with enthusiasm is that people studying the planet and modeling the planet's food system are now saying that one of the big problems of the food system in the 21st century is waste, food waste. And FAO is putting around the ballpark notion that 40% of food is wasted. I do not think it is wasted. And so I'm very skeptical about this figure. And what I feel needs to be done is a lot of field work which actually measures the various circuits in which what some people think is waste is actually moved around inside the urban economy. May I make a final point? And I'm glad to be speaking before Sushruth speaks, because what I also encountered, which gave me a big shock, is that many people think of certain human beings as animals, that they are not fully human. And in my fieldwork, I'm talking about people called Irulas, who were snake catchers and dealt with rats, and who now work in brick kilns and in the waste economy, in the informal, unregistered waste economy. And so many of them said to me, we are treated like animals, or we are not fully human. So other people at this workshop have talked about a process of niching and of domestication. And I'm afraid that my fieldwork looks at something else, which is the dehumanization of people who work in waste. And I have my own ideas. I don't think there's enough time to talk about this now, but I'd be hugely interested in what Sushruth has to say about people whom the rest of society think of as animals. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks a lot. That is wonderful. So before I request Sushruth to comment from his enormous experience, I would like to share it for the set of researchers who are going to use it or use whatever Barbara just shared in context of authoritative units or formation of authoritative units. So the authoritative units in context of how different castes and classes or subdivisions in the society itself would predispose certain sections in the society to react or to interact with animals in those sections would be the core focus of our ecological examination. And of course, the whole idea would be to understand that how these interactions might give opportunities to pathogens to spill from humans to animals and vice versa. So in context of forming assortative units of various classes and subclasses in terms of how human society is designed. So Shraddha, will you please shed light on it briefly? Thanks. I know it is an enormous topic, but if you can briefly share your perspective.
Okay, Nishant, thanks. But do tell me if I haven't addressed a very specific issue that you would like me to, because I'm an outsider to this group of human geographers and zoologists and biologists who are in your team. As a street psychiatrist walking early in the morning at 5:30 on the streets of Camden, talking to the homeless in prostitute dens, garages, bushes, cemeteries, car parks, I find and I do notice, which I've been now wanting to be planning further as a project, is the nature of human-animal relationship across cultures. In that the homeless population in London many of them are with dogs who provide them a place of safety during the daytime, as well as mark the spot for them at night, which shapes the economy of begging activities. Once the dog has marked the place, then it's difficult for other homeless people with their own dogs to come in. But more interestingly, at night, and which is the nighttime economy, when the homeless come alive and are part of that, which involves prostitution, drug dealing, other kinds of forced activities which are very unpleasant and cruel. There is also an association between the dogs that those homeless people have and themselves, in that co-breathing is a very common activity. And that co-breathing takes place for the entire duration of the night in order to ensure that they can sleep well and sleep safe and sleep warm. And at the same time, avoid the constant demand that they have from doctors such as myself for sleeping tablets, which are obviously dangerous, but they also have their own economy to be sold in the market, which we therefore try and avoid. And that co-breathing is not just about co-breathing, it is a development of a human animal self that lasts for a good 8 to 10 hours throughout the night. And this relationship, that is an emergent property of a human animal interaction, is transient, but yet at the same time it's durable. And in a cross-cultural context, I'm interested in looking at how that durability in the Indian setting is shaped by caste. Because the relationship between the cow and the gaushalas and those who subscribe to certain very narrow Hindu ideas about the cow and its sacred notion, that relationship and that self is constituted in a way and configured very differently than those Dalits who are working with pigs or with any other animal that is considered polluting. And that sense of self that comes together, which Barbara was saying, is that when people perhaps internalize an aspect of that identity, they don't do it necessarily voluntarily, it's a relational activity, but in many ways, the structures that create that and force that upon robs people of their agency to even understand at a certain stage who are they and what has happened to them. So there I do in my political therapy work with Dalits on looking at ideas that are derived not just from Fanon and Paulo Freire and Augusto Boal in Brazil, but also from the work of Lacan, who talked about the gaze, but more interestingly, the reversal of the gaze and the resistance of the migrant workers. We have data now, we have good data to show straightforward mental health implications of the current pandemic. But Indian psychiatry as it is and as it exists now is culturally bankrupt. It has not produced any new idea for the last 30, 40 years that I know of. There is a tendency to revert back to ancient Hindu texts to revive certain key concepts of what might be relevant to contemporary psychiatrists. And in a way, it becomes a rather tragic, narrow, truncated, hollow framework. We still rely upon watered down versions of Western psychiatry. We import those ideas. And I think the question about related issues, how are new margins being constructed? And to what extent are existing margins and fracture lines reified or widened at times of such pandemics or crises? So I'll just stop over here because I think this conversation has to brew over time as we hear each other's vocabularies and those words wrap around our bodies, that we might perhaps emerge with something that can allow for dialogues of different kinds.
Thanks a lot to Shuddha, and I think that sets the tone of reaching out to the set of experts who are dealing with human-animal communication and communications in the biological world as such. So I'll approach them before I request Professor Qureshi and Aldina to respond to the applied aspect of it, because their research focuses on utilizing modern tools in science and technology to answer a few of these questions around animal movement and how it can be conceptualized in terms of basic sciences and applied sciences. So Tom, Dara, and Daniel, I would request you to elucidate from your own experience the differences in the animal signals. So for rest of the house, the animal signals qualify at evolutionary scale, wherein the sender of the signal and the receiver of the signal reciprocate each other in a feedback loop. So animal signaling in context of male and female in multiple species is achieved in a very gradual process. So the idea of how a peacock or a male peafowl impresses a peahen has been established through a very slow and gradual instillment of progressive responses. So these are progressed from two modes of exchanging signals. They're called coercions and they're called cues. So it is very likely that a lot of animals tend to pick cues in context of what we are discussing today. So cues are picked by animals for human entities, even if when we do not want certain species in our backyard, by picking those cues, animals would respond to, and they will come and opportunistically consume garbage or whatever we plant in our orchards or fields. As opposed to that, we have cultural practices which have emerged from thousands of years of coexistence, where we coercively feed or we coercively seek response from a target set of organisms. And of course, my own default research in context of opportunistic response of kites found out that people from Muslim community distributed into certain pockets of the city were tossing meat into the air. And of course, it had a clear ecological response in context of the nest site selection behavior and movement ecology. And of course, it also summed up into the population density scale response into the 32 sampling plots we have in Delhi. So I would rest my voice and request Tom, Dara, and Daniel to reply sequentially in context of what I just discussed. It might be very peripheral to what you do, but if you can contribute to this aspect. Thank you.
Well, I'll go first, although I don't know. I don't know if I have anything too substantial to say. As you know, Nishant, I've worked a fair bit on those conceptual distinctions between signals and cues and coercion, and you've summarized them, maybe my main contribution to this meeting, very nicely in your comments. So I'm not quite sure how I can expand. Yeah, give me. I'm still reflecting on your question, so I'm going to pass for a moment. I'll come back.
Sure. So, Dara, would you like to share your perspective? Thanks,
Sure.
Tom.
So, Nishant, in your email, you asked me to reflect on two broad topics. Evolutionary games, that is the study of cooperation and conflict resolution, and animal cultures. And I have a couple of things to say about them, a couple of very initial thoughts that touch upon the questions you just asked, but I think hopefully connect with what other people have said already in some of the fascinating stuff we just heard. So The two topics are evolutionary games and animal cultures, and I'm thinking about how we might apply the techniques by which we study these things to the types of systems that PAWS Web is interested in, namely those systems in which humans live alongside a number of commensal or mutualistic or antagonistic species. So on the topic of game theory, we could ask questions like, to what extent do direct and indirect reciprocity sustain mutualistic relationships between people and members of other species? So for example, to what extent are people reciprocating with black kites or vultures in Delhi? Let's think about the kites, because that's the stuff I know most about from your work. So what do people provide to the kites? What do the kites provide in return? And what incentives for cheating exist for both kites and people? How could you game the system? And in spite of these incentives to cheat, what sustains cooperation so that we have these quite stable systems that become enshrined in cultural practices or laws or those kind of things? So this could get very complicated when we acknowledge that the interactions we are talking about between people and kites, the costs and benefits of reciprocating with kites will be mediated through the behaviors of other species who are also players in these games. So that's the kind of questions we might ask from a game theoretic approach. On the topic of animal cultures, I know less, and I definitely know less than other people who are on this call, but let me have a little crack at it. People who study the evolution of culture in humans and in other species often look at social learning. So that social learning is just a technical term that describes how non-genetic information spreads between individuals in a network. And the people who study this stuff usually study it within a network of individuals of the same species. So social learning in birds or in elephants or in people or something like that. But we have an opportunity, I think, in this group to look at how individuals learn from conspecifics, but also from heterospecifics, from members of other species in these multi-species social networks. For example, how people learn from kites and how kites learn from people. And this brings us into this topic of, to what extent are we picking up in cues, and to what extent have we evolved signals between species? So just in sum on that, I think the game theoretic approach could help us understand what types of behaviors are adaptive in these complex multi-species networks in urban environments. And the cultural evolution approach could help us understand how individuals learn about how to behave in these networks to maximize their fitness. And if we could study these things, then it could give us some evolutionary mechanistic insights into a whole range of phenomena, including conservation institutions, conservation ethics, and persecution ethics. Let's not forget that they exist as well. Processes of co-evolution, assortative networks, and even domestication. So I'd love to work with colleagues here in this group to develop these ideas into tractable and, of course, fundable research questions.
Great. So I guess Dan has a 5-minute slot where he can definitely sum up whatever we wanted as a response. So if Tom would like more time, I guess he can address it during the question answer round. And we have with us Professor Richard Koch now. He's sorry to be late, joining a little late. So Richard, can you introduce yourself? So we gave initially 30 seconds to each of the participants to introduce the broad area of research.
Thanks, Nish. I'm really sorry, but it's just my life is crazy at the moment, you know, with the academic year starting in a week. So I had a lot of problems. I just couldn't get on. Yeah, so my background is wildlife health, interface issues. So I work on zoonotics, on diseases of economic importance, One Health space, if you like. So, you know, obviously looking at what Nishant is, you know, and all of you are interested in, of course, is very much a sort of interface type issue. I'm a vet by training originally, but obviously, you know, science has taken me in all these other directions. So I wouldn't necessarily say I'm a typical vet anymore. And I would actually, I fight a lot with my own profession because I think it's too narrow and too, you know, too over specific in the way it deals with health. So yeah, so a little bit radical that way, but it's a very interesting field you're dealing with, Nishant. So I'm very happy to help where I can. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. I think the good point is that you have arrived at a very right time wherein our questions would be dealing with certain experts here, namely Professor Qureshi, Aldina, and you. And starting with Professor Qureshi, now that he has listened to a lot of inputs from multiple experts, do we have with us Professor Qureshi?
Yes.
Okay. So can you respond to how you would utilize the kind of collective perspectives as you head the reproductive control lab at Wildlife Institute of India? Thanks.
Two parts. What I like to say is that listening to the colleagues on this discussion, what I'm looking at is basically we look at the whole system into three parts. That is demography, demography of community, individual populations, human demography, and the interaction at a behavioral level, whether the animal interaction and the human society's interaction, where you are dealing with various economic strata, the caste system and all that. And the response of all that will be, and also the behavioral aspect of it, how behavior will modify or need to be understood at every level. So there are experts from all these fields to look at a whole range of things. But the outcome will be survivorship broadly in all these three interactions, whether you are talking about demography or behavior, and a survivorship of individuals, communities, and also ideas in the end. So basically what I think we are looking at is these three larger units, and within which several systems operating within that. So the outcome will be how the communities will survive, both animal and people, and ideas will survive.
Sure.
Basically that. Reproductive aspect is one of the part of it, reproductive control, as how to deal with the problem. I just want to highlight for later on for discussion. If you look at Delhi per se, in 1990s, vultures were dominating the skies. And at that time, black kite population was very small. Now, because of the drug-related issue with vulture population decimated, the black kite has come back in a big way. And also brought the completely new dynamics to the things. Vultures, of course, were locally, distributed in the system. Black kite is part local and part migrating to a whole range of places. So it brought completely a different dynamics into the whole new system with their increased population. So dogs, kites, people, all this system are important, but I think what we need to stay focused in is that within the larger system of spatiality of demographies, behavior, and the survivorship outcome, how all other parts, whether it's behavior, human and animal, everything we interact, from epidemiology to economics to everything, all this subsystem within the system can operate, and how we ensure that we able to capture all these subsystems and have an outcome, meaningful outcome to understand the mechanisms.
Sure. Thanks, Professor Qureshi. In line of what you just discussed, we are already convening a manuscript which is based on the master's work of Ms. Urvi Gupta. And Dara has gratefully agreed to substantiate certain theoretical components on that manuscript. And once we have it ready in the preprint form, it would definitely be shared across in context of how loss of vultures and opportunistic responses of other avian scavengers was studied by us during the past 9 years of Black Kite Project. So this was just for the information. In context of what I discussed about randomized control trial, with respect to translocation of animal individuals from one part of the city to another, whenever municipality or likewise government units are trying to gentrify certain spaces. So Richard has written extensively in context of the threat for this part of the world, wherein we take translocations as a firefighting mechanism. We do not have a clear understanding of how we are intervening into a system when X number of organisms are moved from one part of the city to another. So starting with Richard, and then I would request Aldina from her idea of understanding animal ecology and the applied aspects of it. So I'll stop here, sorry.
Okay.
Richard, you can go.
Yeah, very happy to do that. I'm a great believer in the chaos theory, okay, that essentially, I mean, we try and organize everything, and obviously translocations, reintroductions, management, control, you know, these are very human concepts, you know, and we think we can order the universe. Well, you know, I'm afraid it just doesn't work that way. So, you know, so I'm a great believer that in a sense we need to, in a sense, sort of nurture chaos in a way which will enable evolution, I think. I think that's the key thing, because it's the evolutionary process that sort of sorts things out, so that survivorship that you've raised as a very important component of the work you're doing is a reflection of that opportunity for adaptation. If we over control the situation, we tend to disrupt it because we, you know, prevent those interactions. So when we look at, say, pathogen movement, and even the word pathogen is sort of very loaded, because a pathogen is only a pathogen to the organism for which it causes pathology. We share many, many organisms across species, and, you know, most of those organisms are not pathogenic to the majority of their hosts. And there are only, what, 1,400 human pathogens, you know, out of a microbial community of, you know, of sort of many trillions. So, you know, so it's a sort of, yeah, it's an interesting thing. And of course, when you're looking at a city and you're looking at public health and you're looking at veterinary health, it's obviously all linked to a very sort of narrow perspective around that individual. So, you know, keeping that cow alive or keeping that human being alive, etc., or well. And that's inevitable that we would do that, inevitable that as a society we would do that. But I think when it comes to management and ensuring a healthy planet and a healthy community, ultimately, we need to find ways to ensure that there is that adaptability happening, okay? So a lot of people say, well, we've got to keep things separate, but actually I think it's quite the opposite, actually, and we need to find ways to integrate, you know, where we get a sort of balance, better balance. So yeah, so I think that's entering a lot more of the sort of eco-immunology, you know, where people say, well, actually, if you're not exposed to these things, you know, when you are exposed, you become very vulnerable. And COVID-19 is a really good example. So I've just published on the Global Health Security Index, and why is it that the ones with the highest index, in other words, the most prepared countries, are showing the worst results. So it's a sort of paradox, okay? You know, everything we're doing, in a sense, in the natural world is driving, you know, a sort of response, an opposite response. And I think, you know, we end up with these paradoxes, and then we sort of scratching our heads and saying, well, you know, where did we go wrong? And I think it's just fundamental. So the science that you're looking at now, I think is, you know, it has a lot of lessons in it. So you know, and you know, the situation in India is very complex and very, I think, chaotic in a sense, in a biological sense. But I think that's its strength, actually. So I think you have a great opportunity to look at that, you know, whether it be the cultural mix, the species mix, you know, the way you deal with things. I think, you know, there's a lot to learn from that. Thanks.
Thanks, Richard. For the rest of the group, it is just our luck that we have Richard with us, because whether we talk of the context of certain epidemics which impacted human systems, and one which we are already facing, which is COVID, and in context of catastrophic decline in few animal numbers, one of which was decline in the number of lions in Serengeti, and of course, catastrophic decline in the number of taiga antelopes. So the good part would be the extensive experience he has of working in temperate and tropical regions. And he mentioned that even when we have certain chaos into the South Asian systems with respect to the poor understanding from academic perspective, the good part is how well we have kept our culture resilient. So of course, there are many ways on which, or platforms on which it can be tested. And the urban units, which are changing very rapidly and which are very heterogeneously developed, would allow us to do observational experiments with respect to how humans and animals are interacting. And of course, we can do scores of work in context of pathogen screening from tissues and excreta samples. And subsequently, we aim to do, or we aim to contribute by randomized control trial, which is utilized for large scale intervention. So Aldina, sorry for keeping you quiet by all this while, but can you attempt answering the load of introducing randomized control trial while utilizing movement, ecology perspectives, and of course tags, etc., which you're revolutionizing the field of animal movement ecology from one perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Nishan. I think before I do that, I would like to just give a bit more context of the work I have been doing and why I became involved in this project.
Sure.
So I have been working on a system where animals use landfill sites, and I'm interested in understanding responses, animal responses to what we call predictable anthropogenic food resources. And the system that I have been working with, what we've seen is that this was an endangered species back in the 60s. And this species that I work with is a white stork. In Europe, it was endangered at some point. It was reintroduced in several countries. And the populations of European white storks have increased dramatically in recent decades. And in Southern European countries, the storks managed to take advantage of these landfill site resources available. So it's a variety of food that they take from these landfill sites. So we are particularly interested in this system because they adapted to forage on these resources. And in parallel to this, they have changed their migratory behavior. So these animals used to be migratory, and now we have some that are migratory still and some that do not. And it's the same as the kites in India. So I find this really interesting, and from an evolutionary point of view, evolution of migration and the fact that animals manage, or some of them at least, manage to take advantage of these resources. I think it's a very interesting part of the project. And I think this relates to my general interest of understanding how the resources that are available on the planet enable certain populations of wild animals to exist. So humans are now controlling a vast quantity of the primary productivity on the planet, and it's really up to us whether we want to allow other species to have access to these resources or not. In the past, we used to leave seeds in agricultural fields. This was due to agricultural inefficiencies. As agriculture became more efficient, there's less and less food, fewer resources in these landscapes. So there are fewer farmland birds. And we can think about this as human activities are more widespread and have a bigger impact on the availability of primary productivity on the planet. In fact, we can control the abundances of the animals that depend on these resources. And I think this project tackles this from the urban side of things. And I think it's a good way to start because it's where we have the biggest influence. Okay, having said this, and this is like my broad interests in this project, I have been working with the white stork and developing tracking technologies to precisely be able to understand the decisions that these animals take at the individual level. So I have been tracking birds that migrate and birds that don't migrate, trying to understand what they do and what are the influences of these landfill resources on those decisions. Recently, because I also wanted to track smaller animals, I have been involved in developing a new technology, and this is what Nishant was talking about, that is particularly good for urban environments. This is a long-range wireless device that transmits well in urban environments, so transmits information well in urban environments. And now trying to tackle the question you've asked me at the start, these devices have an accelerometer. So for instance, we can understand a bit more about the behavior of the animal. In the case of the storks, I can tell what energy these animals are spending. For every location that I get energy expenditure as well. And the similar types of devices have been used to track cows, for instance, and understand whether the animals are in good condition or not, understand whether they have certain diseases because they walk in a different way. So we can, with the accelerometers, detect whether the animals may be in good health or not. And obviously we would need to use some kind of statistical or machine learning method to then optimize this information. But what we would then need to do is to track individuals that we know are in good health and individuals that we would potentially know that they have a certain disease or may not be in good health. And if we were able to do this, we could then understand the consequences of, if you like, the different diseases for different animal species. So we can think that we can do randomized trials and transfer individuals from one location to another, or understand differences in behavior by following animals in different parts of an urban environment or with different access to resources. We can manipulate the availability of resources and understand how animals will respond to it. So I think the technology offers a lot of possibilities for this project, and it's really up to us to design the questions, or if you like, the randomized trials that we would want to see implemented. I hope I answered your question.
You did, definitely did. The idea of the randomized control trial, I would just like to add to it, was not just restricted from understanding the animals, but the whole perspective of movement of n number of humans from one part of the city to another part as slum rehabilitation exercise, wherein many people take their dogs or other commensals along. And of course, once you move about 20,000, 30,000 people who are occupying a slum unit from one part of the city to another part, you are obliterating the spatial allocation of resources, and not just spatial allocation of resources, but the spatial allocation of how culturally the humans and animals are tied together. So once we will have people understanding the human and animal systems together, these randomized control trials can be optimized in context of why we need to take certain measures while disturbing or taking n number of animals who are considered problematic for one system and move to the other part of the city. So in the past at Wildlife Institute of India and likewise systems, people have removed macaques. So the idea is that the space is again filled up. We do that even in our homes throughout India, that when you put mouse traps, one mice are caught, and then of course that is replaced by another one. So these small and minute questions about interactions can be studied experimentally, and that's the benefit of an urban system. So sorry for all the people who were part of it but were not allowed to introduce themselves. So I will give priority to them to ask questions to the set of experts we have on PAWS Web. So you can open your mic and ask direct questions to respective experts, or you can even give your opinions about whatever we just talked now. So this session was specifically in context of the panel discussion we had, and Then it would be followed by 2 short presentations from Greg and Dan. And then, of course, we will have a last 10-minute round in case we feel we need to have more question and answer session. So the floor is open for people, specifically who could not introduce themselves. So if you can just do a brief introduction by opening your mic and video and ask your question. Thank you.
Nishant, I had a question.
Yes, sure.
If I may, yes, put this question across Dr. Shishud Jadhav.
Yep.
So he discussed about the durability of the have-nots who are shaped with the animals through the contours of caste. So at one point of time, we use the term durability in a positive sense, that existence is based around their perseverance in the state, in the economic state that they are. So in the context of our efforts to move their economic ability on a higher scale, are we trying to leave behind the durability which has come up, of course, through the social structures that they have lived through the ages?
I'm thinking aloud now, and I'm not sure if I can respond to this immediately, but I think maybe if there's a historian amongst us, we might look at certain historical aspects of what the metaphor of lockdown means. Because there have been many communities across castes and religions and animals who have been muted or who have been locked down. And that might help us arrive at understanding the problems we are facing now. As just one aspect of a question that I would be interested is how a series of lockdowns and social distancing, which has been a skill for many communities who have been socially excluded, existing for a long time, what might be learned from them to inform us about the consequences of what we are going through now. That's one aspect of it. I'm not sure whether you asked about durability. I think that durability it can be turned on its head. It's a durability by necessity and force that people have had to invent ways of aligning themselves with society and sometimes often self-excluding themselves in order to keep alive and protect themselves. So then here's personal safety management, both at the animal end and the human end, or in the interaction with each other, becomes critical. So dogs do guard the homeless in London and prevent the homeless from losing their space at night to sleep or the daytime begging space. But in parts of New Delhi, on the outskirts where there are homeless communities, dogs do try and get adopted by a community of beggars or unemployed people or people who are involved with other activities such as drug dealing, so that if there is a raid by the intelligence officials, the dogs sense it and warn the community in advance. So there's a safety management here. And in terms of durability, I think this cuts through religion and caste both. As to, we've decimated most of the tanneries, for example, because of the beef fiasco in India for the last few years. So North India is now devoid of any existing tannery that can tan leather. And the association of that with the cow or with beef or with slaughter is in direct opposition to the association of the sacred cow and the sacred castes. And I think ideas of well-being that are constructed in a relational context between a particular candidate animal differ across the gradient of caste and religion.
Thank you.
Can I jump in? I have something to say in relation to this.
Sure, sure.
So in relation to the question of durability and resilience, and also what was being discussed earlier about caste. So one thing that we found in our recent research on rabies and everyday people-dog interactions, which was published towards the end of last year, is that some of the best lessons on safe cohabitation, right, in terms of preventing bites and chasing, came from people who were involved, were waste workers, rat pickers, narikoravas, who are a scheduled tribe, quite similar to the Irulas that Barbara was talking about. Other kinds of rat pickers and waste workers who tend to come from marginalized caste backgrounds, nighttime economy workers like auto drivers. These were the people who had the richest knowledge on how to share space safely with street dogs. So because we're looking at, what is it that we can learn to kind of, before, instead of thinking about like preventing rabies, how do we kind of address it a step in advance and, work on preventing bites and chasing and all the other kind of like issues associated with street dogs. And so that it demonstrated to us that, we didn't talk about it in terms of durability or resilience, but definitely it demonstrated to us there's a lot to learn from people whose knowledges are often overlooked because they tend to come from marginal social backgrounds, whether they be caste backgrounds or economic backgrounds. And then one thing that we've also been thinking about is how do we use this as a way of challenging and contesting existing social hierarchies, whether they be caste or socioeconomic, right? So if we were to kind of in that piece of work that we published on rabies, we're basically saying that instead of having top-down safe knowledge and awareness programs, we need to think about learning from people who share spaces, and whether they be working spaces or living spaces on an everyday basis, and they come from marginal backgrounds that we often tend to overlook. So it becomes an opportunity, these kind of very specific human-animal relationships, which, as both Shushrit and Barbara pointed out, can vary across the gradient of caste, and I would add class as well, offer opportunities, I think, to challenge and contest very established social hierarchies in the Indian context and elsewhere. So yeah, and the other quick thing I want to add is that, like, in terms of caste, so what's interesting is that, like, some of our historical work shows that, which we've talked about earlier, is that caste moves across the species divide, and many of you might know that the British colonial government, when they kind of came in and saw there were these free living dogs and they didn't know what to do because it didn't make sense, they started referring to them as pariah dogs, using the term pariah, which was used to, or parayan in South India, which was used to refer to groups of people who are considered to be outcast. So this sort of like caste travels and across species boundaries, and then it works to reinforce patterns of exclusion and marginalization, whether it's human or animal, and and therefore I think any kind of like intervention or contesting of these systems, problematic systems, needs to look at how these ideas work across humans and animals.
Great. So
Hi, I have something to add. Sorry.
Shubhang, I will just make a comment in context of pariah, which Kritika was just adding, that the same term was also used for kite. So it is just interesting to see how well we club not just humans as pariah, but also non-humans, and of course across specific dimensions under the block of the pariah. Somebody has kept the mic open with some sound in the background. I would request that particular person to switch off the mic. Shubhangi, please go on.
Yeah, hi, I'm Shubhangi Srivastava, and I'm working as a PhD scholar in Man Barwa's ERC project in urban ecologies, and I'm looking at dogs and their ecologies and how humans interact with them in cities. So I've been doing fieldwork in Delhi since until lockdown, and I wanted to add to this ongoing discussion here about how social hierarchies with humans, it is affecting and shaping the relationships with animals. And what I've seen is these hierarchies are all the class hierarchies. They're affecting in a way that these are also creating different categories of dogs, which I've been studying how, and then how people are thinking of different the idea of life which is coming out, where people think of the street dog, which they address as the Lavaris dog, which means homeless dog basically, and how the Lavaris dog is doesn't have a achhi life, it doesn't have a good life, and how they are associating good and standard living with dogs with breed dogs or pet dogs who are roaming around, they say, as they're saying, in air-conditioned cars or having soap to bathe every day. How that is also these social hierarchies in humans are also creating these categories of dogs, say the Lavaris dog or the breed dog, and then there's also the abandoned dogs, and which Professor Jadhav was talking about, how homeless people are interact with homeless dogs, these street dogs, and how that relationship is building on. And on the other hand, there are people who have migrated to different, say Delhi from other states, and they're working in MNCs and all, and how they're living a sort of isolated life, and then how they are interacting with these breed dogs and pet dogs, how these different sects of people, these different classes of people, they are having different kinds of relationships with different dogs, is something which is very interesting, which in Delhi, in the same city, these different kinds of relations can be seen as being drawn if we look at how the social hierarchies are affecting the relationships. Yeah.
Great that the lockdown has ended and we can probably share these perspectives in person. Unfortunately, Shalini's mic has broken. So before I read out her question, from the set of people who are listening to us, I would request some comments of directing this PAWS web initiative to a certain positive direction from Professor Anindya Sinha. So will you please switch on your mic? So thanks. Ranada, are you there?
I believe it's Professor Anindya Sinha.
Okay. I think he's not listening to at least whatever I just said. So I'll just read out what Shalini put in the chat box. Has anyone come across any studies on negotiations between animal lovers and non-lovers / indifferent folks in context of placemaking or decision making, especially in urban context? I wonder what such negotiations in rural and urban context might tell us about coexistence and conflict. So before someone else takes the chance to answer, I have one small aspect to share, probably aligning with what you asked, Shalini. It is with respect to certain people in a colony, in a residential block within Delhi, where we had people who wanted to feed dogs. And of course, then there were people who were affected by dogs being fed by certain people, and those dogs were particularly aggressive to the ones who were slightly strangers or who did not participate in feeding. So the matter rose and escalated in size, where there was a clear squabble in between two groups, and strengthening in terms of like 50 versus 10. And of course, the lower number was of the people who were dog lovers. And this matter was stretched for quite long, for about 10 years in Delhi's High Court. And finally, the High Court suggested that in each colony or in each residential block within Delhi, where people would like to feed dogs, there needs to be a place or a feeding platform. So while this was a kind of a firefighting mechanism or a very proximate approach to solve this issue, if somebody who understands basic animal behavior would again interject that creating a feeding platform into the middle of a residential block might have another domains of spreading or constricting the conflict in context of those dogs responding to certain strangers in ways which are considered conflicting. So I would welcome comments from other set of people if they have. Anmol, you have a really long paragraph, so it's best that you show your face and show your participatory and read it out yourself. I hope your mic is not broken. I'll read out what Shalini has responded to you. Thank you. So if people would like to respond in context of what Shalini just asked.
I can just very briefly say, so my earlier work looked at such negotiations at the institutional level, like between, not at the neighborhood level, but at the national and city levels, where it focused on the debates that emerged around the killing of 2 children in Bangalore in 2007 by street dogs, and the kind of like the Operation Dog Hunt, as the media called it, that was launched afterwards. And so I have a paper that looked at how the responses and counter responses that emerged in after these 2 incidents involved multiple groups, both formal and informal, whether they be pro-dog or anti-dog. So it's at I don't know at what kind of scale Shalini is looking for research of this kind, but that was at the sort of institutional, national scale.
Great. I think even Richard has responded to Shalini, so I'll read it out just for the house while other people wait to answer. So Richard responded to Shalini's question saying, cultures, one about loving animals, one not, occur in post-colonial communities like Kenya. The city of Nairobi has a society for protection of animals. It is a residual from British colonial period embedded in the communities that do not treat animals kindly. They would be a resource for this question, and I'm sure many other examples. So in context of what Richard just said, we have on PAWS web team Lucas, and of course Richard has worked there since 1985 in Kenya, addressing questions around human, livestock, and wild animal interface. And of course, the whole idea of how we settle down with the same set of animals very differently within the same country and within different and across different country systems and regimes would be the future aim of PAWS Web. But before we actually start to do these kind of research interventions, we can definitely publish something collaboratively, because I think we have had a lot of perspectives in that regard, which can be shared across the domain, which is definitely beyond PAWS Web Group. So I think there are a lot of people who would be interested to listen about what we just shared as opinions. So Manda, are you supposedly going to add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to, I think probably to broaden out the discussion and, to think of the sort of network that you're talking about and building. I think one critical aspect, and this is what Deepu Avadindra Sharan really pointed out, and Sushrit and I have been working on this actually in a recent paper with Rana, is to, in a way, also move beyond zoonosis. So the moment you have zoonosis as a framing of a lot of these sort of relations about health, you're missing out on a range of other things where animals contribute to, say, well-being in urban spaces. And a lot of this derives from a Western model of what the city is and what the city should be, what a good city is. Mm-hmm. I think it's really vital to look at that other dimension. So not just simply whether people like dogs or they dislike dogs and so on and so forth, but the critical role, I think Sushrit pointed this out, in the case of dogs is the kind of affective bonds that people have in the streets in London. And with macaques, we find how it's really vital for, well-being. Feeding macaques is embroiled in a whole range of other practices that have to do with astrology and so on and so forth. So I think my broad comment is that, for a network like this, when you're looking at the question of health, it has to be opened up not just to zoonosis and the disease risk, but also the kind of forms of well-being that living with animals enable in the Indian city. And not to start with a model of the Western city, but to actually think, well, what could these cities be like? Why actually living with animals is so crucial to everyday life as well. So it's just a broad question, I think, for people to reflect on, but maybe something you might take forward. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Manda. And I think this is what we aim to cover as potential research which would take shape down the line, is kind of breaking down the overarching concept of Indians being very philanthropic or religiously patronizing to animals, starting from the animals which are within the city as commensals to the ones which are within the national parks itself. So we have a whole range of cultural responses, and I guess these cultural responses have been preserved in a certain sense, supposedly emanating from human-animal communication, and that communication level, of course, differs from one animal species to another animal. And the best example of how this communication can extend to the level of two species socialite is exhibited by human-dog relationship. It is probably the biggest control experiment which human beings have done out in open in the streets through various ways and means of interventions which change from one part of the world to another. And I guess in future when we meet, we can keep a session from Greg Larson. He left because he had certain errands to attend, but otherwise this was a very valuable suggestion. So I think the floor is open for people to contribute. Thank you. So I guess we are already 10 minutes beyond our scheduled session, which was the inaugural session. I think we have a lot of enthusiasm, and even despite we have extended the session beyond 10 minutes, we still have 24 people, which means this group would go on to the next session, and hopefully we would bring down things to more nuanced exchanges where people can be given certain slots while others passively listen and understand better and wait for their turn to share perspectives. So with this, I would arrest what I was saying, and I would request Prashant to come and close the session formally. Thank you.
We had discourse across disciplines, and of course we touched upon many points ranging from the shift from pattern to process as explained by Professor Gregor Larson, and also as delineated by Professor Ben Sheldon as to how our research has to study the interactions which are structured between the individuals and their interaction with the animals. Well, Dr. Mann also talked about finding ecology in politics and the question of health, which has to find a place in politics, because that is there. We try to find the political will to actually move forward our point, which is somewhere invested in biology of our ecological structure across disciplines. Well, Dr. Kritika Srinivasan also talked about her work on street dogs and how more and more disciplines are needed to be gone through to derive a beneficial understanding and our learning from human-animal conflict and human-animal cooperation, which is both a flip side of the coin. Well, I'm really intrigued by the question which was put across by Professor Barbara, where she though distanced herself from the fine nuances of specific disciplines by other experts, but there she drove a question as to what is waste and how do we identify waste. What would be waste for others may not be waste for people who are living in far challenging environments. That would be a resource for them. So she also talked about division of labor across waste handling and small-scale industries. And there she cited a requirement for a study for what is actually waste, which many people who are, and how people who are considered animals are existing there, which are inherent part of our ecosystem. Quickly moving to Dr. Jadav's enunciation about durability of have-nots, who are shaped with the animals with whom they live, and they derive their strength from their eco-structure, which are also based on the contours of caste. If we talk about India, we had a question across this enunciation, and we had many insightful dialogue from our experts. Well, we had Dr. Dara as well as Professor Richard talking about evolution of culture, social learning, and opportunities to know how individuals learn from the animals. And there, Professor Richard talked about the chaos theory and how that chaos theory finds and becomes an antithesis to the human concept of management and sustainability. So as a group, as interdisciplinary, cohesive attitude that we are trying to build across our specific disciplines, that is a difficulty that I personally draw, that we have to find a parallel between disciplines, but that is what we are trying to do here. We are also thankful to Professor Qureshi for talking about the vultures and kites and how the projects that he has led has given specific findings on their ecosystem and their movement in South Indian and South Asian context. Well, Dr. Aldina also talked about the resources which are placed across animal sustainability, the placement of devices which can be used to understand their health aspects, and a corollary to that would be if we find negative consequences and if we find a bad health dealing with the movement of animals, that would give an opportunity to study and to find out if we are dealing with movement of diseases across borders or across continents and countries. So quickly summing up the entire discourse, we are really thankful to our experts across the disciplines. We are thankful for people who have taken out time. We are, of course, thankful to all other participants who would be perhaps contributing more actively in the coming sessions. And we have already taken much time. We also had a session where we had to go through presentations, but I'm sure Nishant and Navneet, we would be able to place that in a more comfortable forthcoming session. So nice introduction for everyone, and perhaps the floor is now open to draw the parallels which we are talking about. Perhaps the next sessions would be more clearer, where we find we hold hands across disciplines. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Good night, everyone, for India, and a good evening for other parts. And I can go on for different sections of the world we are occupying. It is the sheer pleasure of sharing a virtual platform where even within crisis, we can share perspectives. I guess this is just the beginning of what we might do in a long session of our association, formal or informal, in whatever ways possible. Thanks for your patience and enthusiasm. See you next time. Bye-bye.